Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of Ephesians, and today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark and Chris Rexroad, and our question comes from Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Paul's talking about being a prisoner. Most of these epistles, or several of the epistles, he writes from prison. Prison epistles. In verse 13, he says, "Don't lose heart because of my trials here. I am suffering for you, so you should feel honored." He can write some arrogant statements. Sometimes when I read them, I go, "What?" I think that was his nature.
I think so.
And he was very, very much to the point.
Blunt.
Yeah,
Would say
he was an Enneagram 8. I'm convinced.
But think about it. That was necessary for him to address the issues and even the churches. To be able to hey, this is it. Let's deal with it head on.
And the rulers of the area.
Yes.
So my question today is this: can we suffer for other people? And if we can, how?
I put in my notes here that even related to this verse, that he suffered to benefit others and not necessarily in place of, if that makes sense. But I do think we can choose. I'm gonna probably create a problem for myself here. Choose to suffer at times for others. And let me try to give you a couple examples of my thought processes here. As it relates to, for instance, finances. I think about my early days as a single man and then as a married man early on. Struggles, suffering, but making choices and decisions in the midst of that suffering, struggle, that would benefit others so that they wouldn't. So that when my kids came along, when they got older, not that they could have what they wanted or everything they wanted, but they could have what they needed, but also to teach them how to handle finances. And in a sense, it was choosing to suffer, delaying some things you would like to do for a bigger, better principle. I'm thinking in the terms of marriage relationships. I might get some kickback here, but sometimes I am convinced that we choose to, quote, suffer in and through seasons, whatever it may look like, in order that our children or grandchildren won't have to suffer the pain of, say, for instance, divorce. And that's not a judgmental, critical statement. My wife, no doubt, has suffered through many seasons with me at times, but we did those things for a bigger purpose, so that, again, children, grandchildren, legacy wouldn't have to. And so I think there are some instances where we can suffer for other people to that degree, but I think you have to be open-minded to realize that. It's not just me jumping in and say, well, Chris got this speeding ticket, so therefore I'm going to go down to the courthouse and pay for it. I'm going to suffer for his sake. I don't even think that's what that means.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. So when does it do? When does it need to be paid off?
It's late.
So I do think we can, in some ways, suffer for other people to prevent a bigger suffrage later.
And there's ones that, it's kind of hard to describe, but where we walk alongside of somebody else that's going through a lot of pain, and you're helping them out in different ways. It requires your time, and as Jay said, your finances sometimes, and the heartbreak that you go through with them when they're in this type of pain. And a lot of these things the public may not know about, and you're walking through with them, so you're able to suffer along with them. But then
you act like it's a privilege.
What?
You're able to. You act like it's a privilege.
I would say it's more if you're called to go and do that. That I personally have a heart to help people when they're in need, when they are hurting and stuff like that. But other people, like missionaries, I sit there and think about them. They go to some of the hardest places in the world. Not all of them, but some of them go to the hardest places, and they give up a whole lot of stuff in order to go there. Family, friends, time growing up around people to go and to benefit these people. But there's suffering. There's lots of places that they go to that they will physically suffer while they're there for the benefit of the
They
people
see a
in the
bigger
kingdom.
picture, a bigger
Yeah.
cause. Yeah.
I can think of situations in churches. I can think of a situation here years and years ago, where for the good of the people, the leadership suffered many untruths. That's the way I would put it. But they understood that to go public only harms people. And so they endured a lot of the leadership at the time. Endured a lot of suffering, and eventually it proved they were right.
It righted itself.
That's right. It just took time. In this case, what I would assume is that they could have put all of them in prison, but because Paul's the ringleader, has such influence, that him being in prison satisfies most of the Jewish leaders, and so he's suffering, so they don't have to. It takes some heat, some pressure off them if he takes the heat, And there are times where we are required to have a conversation on behalf of some other people. So there should be some other people speaking up, and they don't or haven't. And, you speak up for them and you take the heat. And I can tell you, having to speak up on somebody's behalf where you're going to get the brick and they're the ones that should be getting it. It's painful. It's absolutely painful. And so I do think we suffer. Even Paul would say, bear one another's burdens. Anytime you pick up somebody else's burden, there's some suffering that goes along with it. Yeah. You can't bear someone else's burden and not suffer. And it doesn't matter what it is. If they come to you with marital issues or a struggle with addiction or they're wrestling financially. And I tell people the difference between professional counselors and pastors is professional counselors their job, their vocation is to listen and to maybe give advice. For the most part, a counselor's job is to listen, but guide, direct. But there's a certain detachment as pastors and believers and leaders. We don't get that privilege. We consider them to be our brothers and sisters in the Lord. You don't get to say, I'm going to give them this advice. I don't really care what happens. It can't be that way. You may want to. There have been times, I heard Jay grunt, there have been times I wanted to, like, okay, here's the advice. And you can take it or leave it, but I ain't going to cry a tear for you, if you want to keep down that path. You feel that way sometimes, but you can't. You don't get to offset it. You don't get to lay it aside.
Which is part of the suffering process.
It is. It's part of the suffering process. In a case of addiction, for example, the person who has addiction isn't the only one suffering. That family is bearing that burden. Sometimes it's financial, it's time, it's worry, it's stress, all of those things. Even things that aren't. We can have a debate about addiction, whether it's choice or not, or whatever. But sickness, someone who has an illness that maybe leads to death or incapacitates, is that the right word?
Yeah,
or debilitates.
Long term,
where they got to take care of them.
Sure.
the person sick is not the only one suffering. The person who's caring for them is also suffering because, I had a recent conversation. He's like, the person was saying, my spouse needs me right now. I can't do anything else. I've got to, I'm their driver. I'm their caretaker. I've got to be here for whatever they do. And it's not just the person who struggles physically that suffers. It is also the other person. So I think we may not suffer for them, but we certainly suffer with them.
100%. Yeah, because I've often said that caregivers in those circumstances, I'm convinced, sometimes suffer more than the patient themselves because of all the external things attached to it. They're right there in it.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Ephesians.